This is St. Louis on the Air from St. Louis Public Radio.
I'm Alex Heuer, sitting in for Elaine Cha. This hour is all about cats, and get your cat questions ready because we'll be taking calls later in the show. So, about those cats. There are about 600 million of them in the world, and in the US there are as many as 100 million pet cats and another 30 million that are unowned. Basically, there are a lot of cats. And for many people, they hold a special place in our lives. Cats are our companions. They cuddle, entertain, play, and sleep with us. Sometimes they're loners and standoffish, and for some reason, cats always seem to knock things off of tables, nightstands, and any other surface that's a few feet above the ground. Cats also have a fascinating history. And here with me to talk about all of that is Jonathan Losos. He's an evolutionary biologist at Washington University and the founding director of the Living Earth Collaborative. That's a unique partnership between WashU, the St. Louis Zoo, and the Missouri Botanical Garden. Jonathan is the author of the new book, The Cat's Meow: How Cats Evolved from the Savannah to Your Sofa. Jonathan, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much, Alex. It's a delight to be here.
I first want to say that I enjoyed the book, and part of the reason is that I love cats, but I promise you there are reasons to love this book, even if you are not a cat person. But to get started, Jonathan, I have to ask, in the science world, you are renowned for your research on lizards. Why did you write a book about cats?
Well, the reason is this. I've been crazy about cats since I was 5 years old, since we adopted a cat from the Animal Protective Association, still there on Hanley Road. So I've been wild about cats, but as I developed scientifically, it never occurred to me to study cats, to do research on them, for two reasons. One is that I wanted to study animals in nature, to observe what they do and where they go and so on. And anyone who's tried to follow a cat knows that that's basically impossible. As soon as they figure out what you're doing, which is pretty quickly, they immediately duck into a bush or run away, and you can't do it. So cats didn't seem a good subject for the sort of research that I was interested in doing. Moreover, I was under the impression that there really isn't much interesting research being done on domestic cats. I just thought it wasn't happening. And so I spent my career studying lizards, which are a very good organism to study for many reasons. However, about 10 years ago, I came to realize that I was mistaken, that in fact there is a lot of very interesting cat science going on, and that people were studying cats in the same way I study lizards and people study elephants and lions and so on, using all the latest techniques like GPS tracking and genome sequencing and so on. And then I had what I have to claim was a great idea. I would teach a class to college freshmen called The Science of Cats.
And this was at Harvard?
This was at Harvard when I was there, yes. And although I'm now teaching at WashU as well. And the idea was I would lure students in on cats, and then I would teach them how we study nature, how we study evolution, ecology, and so on, just using cats as the vehicle. And so the class was great fun, and that led me to writing a book with the same intention.
So cats were the way to draw people in, but you also write that cats maybe aren't necessarily the sexiest animal to study from a scientific perspective. Why is that?
Well, aspiring zoologists want to go out into the Serengeti or the rainforest of the Amazon and study some exciting animals, elephants or some exotic lizard or snake or so on. And domestic animals they just seem like not the sort of thing you want to study. And so that's part of the reason I thought there wasn't much cat science out there. It's the same reason people don't study squirrels. They want to go to the Amazon to study something, not their backyard.
Well, and as you write about, there is a great deal to learn about cats, their evolution, their history, and what the future holds for them. So I want to get to the domesticated cat in a moment, but what do we know about the first cats that ever lived?
Well, the first cat appeared in the fossil record about 30 million years ago. And it was clearly a cat. If you saw one walking down the street, you would say, well, look at that cat. Its legs are a little short, but that's a cat.
And this is 30 million years ago?
30 million years ago, yes.
And you also write that there are some 60 species of cats, and that virtually speaking, that the number of species of cats hasn't really changed that much.
Well, the fossil record doesn't show us all that many species. And in particular, 20 million years ago was an important point in cat evolution. The cat lineage broke into two groups. One of those was the saber-toothed cats, and the other was the regular-toothed cats, to which all of today's species belong. And it turns out in the fossil record, there are a lot more species of saber-toothed cats than there are of the type around today. And why that is, we don't know, but there were lots of saber-toothed cats and not so many of the others.
And finding fossils of cats, though, is somewhat difficult, especially in certain environments.
Well, yes, it's in tropical areas, for example. When an animal dies, it tends to rot very quickly. Its carcass does, and so it doesn't turn into stone and become a fossil. And so that may be one of the reasons that we don't have fossils of some sorts, of some types, because they lived in areas where fossilization just is less likely to occur.
So your book is primarily about the domestic cat, but the cat family is somewhat large. There are tigers and leopards and lions, jaguars, servals, cheetahs, ocelots. And you also write that a cat is a cat. What do you mean by that?
Well, there is a certain essence of felineness that is true of all members of the Felidae, that you would see any cat and have no doubt that it is a member of the cat family. And that's true for all the fossil species we know as well. Even saber-toothed cats with their long canine teeth still are very clearly cats. So in terms of anatomy, I mean, there is some variation, of course. Cheetahs have very long legs, and there are other specific features of cats, but they all are very similar. And that's also true of their behavior as well. Zookeepers have told me that if you can read the body language of your pet cat, you can understand what's going on in the mind of a lion or a tiger. They really are very similar from one species to another.
There are many wildcats, but you write a lot about the African wildcat, and that's because domestic cats evolved from the African wildcat. What does that cat look like?
That cat looks pretty similar to a house cat. I like to say that if you looked out your window into your backyard and saw an African wildcat, you would not say, "What is an African wildcat doing in Olivet?" But rather you'd say, "What a cool looking cat. I've never seen one quite like it." They really are very similar. Their legs are a little longer, but you could easily mistake one for a domestic cat.
And you've traveled to Africa. You've seen an African wildcat. You also there's one section where you're driving and you shout with excitement. This is you write about the way that your wife reacted, but you saw a serval. For those who don't know, what is a serval?
Well, a serval is a small cat. It's a little bit larger than a domestic cat. It can get up to 30, 35 pounds. It has a beautiful spotted coat like a cheetah or a leopard. It has very long legs like a cheetah. So you might say it looks a little bit like a small cheetah. But it's this beautiful cat with really big ears, and it lives in the savannas of Africa, throughout much of Africa.
And why were you so excited to see one?
It's just a cool cat. It's so beautiful looking. It also has this great way of hunting where it has these really big ears, so it can detect the slightest rustle in the grass of a mouse moving through it. And so it will sit there peering intently with its ears directed forward, and then it will jump into the air, leaping in an arc, and then land on its forepaws, pinning the rat or whatever, and then catching it and eating it.
So you write about two possible times and locations when cats and humans began closely associating. But before we get to those specific times and places, what is the difference between a close association and then domestication?
Well, there are many animals that adapt to living around humans. One example, just today, raccoons and opossums are taking advantage of humans and living with us. And that's probably the first step in domestication of many animals. They just start living around us. In the case of domestic cats, it started with the African wildcat. And what happened is about 10,000 years ago in the Middle East, in the region of the world, that's where human civilization first began. And people settled down and stopped being hunters and gatherers and lived in villages and grew crops and began agriculture. And so they stored these crops, the excess amount of it, and that attracted rats and rodents and other rodents, and that in turn attracted the African wildcats. Now, these were wild cats, but they learned that there's a food resource in villages with people, and if they could adapt to being around people, they could take advantage of that. And that's how domestication surely began for cats.
And what was that interaction like? Was it just a matter of rather than becoming hunter-gatherers, they were humans were settling down and farming, and so there were scraps, and that there was just the availability of food? Is it as simple as that?
Yes, initially it was all on the cat side of things. This was a resource that we inadvertently provided for the cats by having our storage facilities that attracted the rodents. The cats were attracted to that, and so it was all on the cat side that it began. But then it's very possible that people saw the advantage of having cats around. They saw them eating rodents. They knew that rodents were bad for their food. And so maybe they encouraged the cats. Maybe they put out a little extra food or gave them a warm, dry place to sleep. And in turn, the cats that were most willing to take advantage of that would have the most kittens and pass on whatever genes were responsible for them being willing to associate with people. And so we can imagine this back and forth dance, if you will, of the cats hanging around people, the people being nicer to the cats being hanging around more, and eventually you have your domestic cat.
So now those specific times and places. One that you write about is the Mediterranean, the island of Cyprus in the Mediterranean, and the other is Egypt. What is the evidence for both in terms of domestication?
Well, the first evidence we have of cats associating with people is from the island of Cyprus in the eastern Mediterranean Sea near Turkey. And it is a burial site where there is a person buried with a cat very carefully buried at the person's feet. And this person was buried with many treasured possessions. And so the implication is that this cat, very carefully buried as well, was another treasured possession of the person. So that clearly shows an association, but we don't even know if that was an African wildcat or a domestic cat. And it could very well have just been an African wildcat that was very friendly and hung around the village where the person lived. So it shows that associations had begun by then, but isn't concrete proof of domestication. Now, so that was 10,000 years ago. If you fast forward to about 3,500 years ago, it's very clear that cats are domesticated in Egypt, because we see paintings on tomb walls with cats with collars on, eating out of dishes under the dining room table, sitting in people's laps. So very clearly, by then, domestication had occurred. But what we don't know is, did that occur closer to 10,000 years ago, perhaps somewhere else in the Mideast, or did it occur closer to 3,500 years ago in Egypt?
Well, I want to pick up on Egypt in just a moment, but we have to take a quick break. We'll be back shortly to continue this conversation. And we want your cat questions. You can tweet your cat questions to us at STL On Air. You can send an email to talk@stlpr.org, or you can give us a call at 314-382-8255. That number is 314-382-TALK. This is St. Louis on the Air on St. Louis Public Radio.
Support comes from the Missouri Forest Products Association, committed to conservation and careful management of the state's forests to make them more resilient and better habitats for wildlife. ChooseWood.com.
Welcome back. I'm Alex Heuer. My guest is Jonathan Losos. He's an evolutionary biologist at Washington University and the author of the new book, The Cat's Meow: How Cats Evolved from the Savannah to Your Sofa. So I want to pick back up on ancient Egypt. Do we know why Egyptians revered cats?
Well, through their long history in Egypt, there were a series of different gods that were worshipped. And about 3,000 years ago, the god that became the most important was named Bastet. And many gods were portrayed, at least in part, with the body of an animal. And Bastet had the body of a woman with the head of a domestic cat. And so cats were essentially the totem animal of Bastet. And so cats were revered as being associated with the god Bastet. And so cats at that time were basically the number one animal in terms of reverence.
And they are there are mummies of cats even, and you talk about how cats were mummified, but then years later about how there was a bit of a racket involved with the mummification of cats.
Well, so this is a little perverse and it's a little ugly, so tune out if you don't want to hear something unpleasant. But even though cats were revered, they were also raised in large numbers in order to be killed and turned into mummies. And the reason is that when people went to temple to ask for an offering from the god, they would take from Bastet, the goddess, they would bring a votive offering, and that votive offering was often a cat mummy. And so the temples would breed the cats and sell them, probably as a way of making money, and the people would take these cat mummies and deposit them in the temples by the thousands. And then these mummies were then taken down into the catacombs, appropriately named, beneath the temples and stored, and there were just thousands and thousands of them, which then were unearthed by archaeologists in the last century.
And people in Egypt would even shave their eyebrows as a way to mourn a cat's passing.
Yes, they did that. If you killed a cat, that was punishable by death. So they took cats very seriously. They also tried to keep cats from leaving Egypt. They passed laws that you could not take a cat out of Egypt because they didn't want them spreading away.
And that was all well and good, but then the Romans invaded Egypt. What happened to the reverence of cats, and what happened to cats in general after the Romans invaded?
Well, on the one hand, Bastet's star faded, and with that, the reverence that cats became cats again. At the same time, cats spread around the world. Despite the Egyptians' attempts to keep them in Egypt, they got on boats, they got on ships, and were taken to Europe and elsewhere. They were probably encouraged by sailors, and so in that way, they got out to Europe and elsewhere, and then spread throughout the world.
Yeah, talk a little bit more about the spread of cats. Who did the spreading? And of course, cats can move themselves, but how did cats spread across the world?
Well, they were, as I said, they probably initially moved at least to Europe, to the north, on ships, where either intentionally on the parts of the sailors or maybe just cats hopped aboard. The sailors may have wanted them to control rodents on the ships. And then they arrive in Europe and they hop off the boat and live there. So they were present in Greece certainly by 1000 BC. And then from Greece, they spread to Rome, and then from Rome throughout the Roman Empire. And so that's how they traveled through Europe. Although, interestingly, there's some recent evidence that the Vikings may have played a role in moving cats around as well. Based on some genetic studies, it seems likely that Viking longships visited the Mediterranean, picked up some cats, and transported them to northern Europe, and perhaps from there to the United Kingdom, Iceland, and elsewhere. And so that's how cats got into Europe. At about the same time, maybe 2,000 years ago, they also spread eastward into Asia, both by ships through the Gulf of Arabia to India and across the Silk Road to Pakistan, India, China, and so on.
There are also other wild cats. We've been talking about the African wildcat, but there was also one in Asia and a European wildcat. Why is it, though, that the domesticated wildcat came from the African wildcat? What is it about the European wildcats and the Asia wildcat that didn't cause their domestication?
Well, that's a great question, and there's two possibilities, and they both may be correct. On the one hand, the African wildcat may have just been the right cat in the right time, that they happened to live in the area where civilization first began in what's called the Fertile Crescent, and so that was the species that was present where people settled down and raised crops and so on. But on the other hand, it turns out that African wildcats have a very gentle disposition, that even wildcats, if you raise them from kittens, can be nice pets. That they're very tame, and so they may have been predisposed to be a species that would hang out with people and to be able to domesticate. By contrast, the European wildcat, which is closely related to the African wildcat, has a completely different disposition. It's known to be, and I'm quoting here, hellaciously mean. And so no matter how nicely you raise them as kittens, they turn out to be terrible pets because they're just nasty. And so it may have been that, the disposition of the African wildcat played a role as well.
And you mentioned the Vikings. I have a footnote to our conversation which involves one of your footnotes in the book, and you say that it is a fallacy, that it is a myth that Vikings wore horned helmets, that the rendering of Vikings with a horned helmet was created by an artist and then popularized in Wagner's operas. I just thought that was a fascinating footnote, by the way, because I learned something new about Vikings.
Well, I have to say it was really fun. I came to that because that research study I mentioned that showed that the Vikings may have taken cats to Northern Europe was a viral hit on the internet. And there were all these pictures of cats on ships wearing Viking helmets. I mean, they're kind of hilarious, and many different people came up with the same image. And somehow that led me to finding out that Viking helmets didn't actually even exist.
So back to aside from the footnote, you said that there's some of the wild cats were friendly enough, some were mean, and you write that domestic cats are barely or only semi-domesticated. Why is that?
Well, the basis for that statement, as I've already mentioned, that they look pretty much like a regular domestic cat, and they behave to a large extent like a domestic cat. And when you look at their DNA is very similar to domestic cats. So standard cats have changed very little from their ancestors.
I want to go to the phones now. And again, you can call us with your cat questions. You can give us a call at 314-382-8255. That's 314-382-TALK. Let's go to Joe calling from Concord Village. Joe, you're on St. Louis on the Air.
Hi. I'm very interested in this show about the history of cats. It's amazing to me. I did not care for cats, and I grew up raising dogs, German Shepherds, and I just moved in with my fiancée in Concord Village, and she has 2 cats, and I have become a cat lover.
What do you love about cats, Joe?
They are just so different and loving. I have a cat, Tink and Spencer, and they love to get. I'm a retired Teamster, and they love to get on my big belly and sit on my belly. And they're very smart, and I can even just reach over and let the one cat, one's an outdoor, one's indoor, let the outdoor cat out the window, and he's as good as gold. And I just, is anybody that doesn't like cats really ought to try and get one. And they are a lot of fun. They're so much fun and entertainment.
Joe, does your cat knead your belly or create those biscuits by moving its legs?
He does. Spencer does. Yeah, he kneads my belly, and he'll just sit up there on my belly like he's the king of my belly. And he just, I'm sitting in my recliner, and he just is happy as a clam. Of course, I think my fiance is getting a little jealous because the cats are. I'm around the cats a little more, and they take to me a little more now than mom.
Well, thank you so much for calling, Joe. Jonathan, why do cats create those biscuits? Why do they do that kneading?
Well, that's a great question, and it's very interesting behavior. All feline species, when they're kittens or cubs, use that kneading behavior when they're nursing from their mother, and they will knead with their paws on her belly, probably to stimulate milk flow. However, it appears that domestic cats are the only species in which that carries on into adulthood. And so presumably this is a behavior that in some way has evolved during domestication. It's one of the few things that have evolved in domestic cats as a way of building a social bond with humans and signaling contentment.
And there are other things about cats, for example, the way that they purr or meow. I was interested in learning is that generally cats don't meow to other cats. It's primarily a way that they communicate with us.
Yes, that was a surprise to me as well. I had always assumed that cats meow to each other to communicate, and that when they're meowing to us, they're just including us in their social circle. But in fact, researchers have shown by studying cats living in colonies that they rarely meow at each other to communicate. They make other sounds, hisses, growls, and so on, to communicate, but not meowing. And so meowing as a way of communicating is another trait that has evolved during domestication as part of living with us.
Cat owners will usually know exactly what their cat's meow means, whether they want outside, or whether they're hungry, or whatever it might be. And there was a study that you wrote about where college students listened to different meows. Tell us about that study.
Yes. Well, so cats, anyone who's lived with a cat realizes cats have different meows that they will make, and they often make them in different contexts. But it turns out that there is no uniform cat language, that a certain meow for any cat means I'm hungry, or a different meow means I want to get out of this room or something. And so researchers recorded the different types of meows and played them to just a bunch of college students, and the students couldn't tell you what that meow meant. But when you played those same meows to the person who lived with that cat, that person was very accurate in saying, oh, little Sheba is hungry, or Oliver is cold, or whatever. And so it turns out that cats and the people they live with develop their own private language where they use different meows and people understand what they mean.
What about purring?
Well, purring is another trait that has been modified during domestication. I should point out that all small species of felines, of which there are many, they all meow and they all purr. But nonetheless, during domestication, the domestic cat has changed its meowing and purring. And in purring, domestic cats have two types of purrs. One is the very contented purr, very soothing purr that you'll hear when you're petting your cat on your lap, or a cat that is content. But there's a second purr that is much louder and more insistent. It's like a chainsaw. It goes boom, boom. And this is the cat saying, I want something. If you've ever had a cat, you're opening a can of wet food in the kitchen and the cat is rubbing against your legs and making this very loud purr, you know what I mean. And people rate this purr when they hear it as very demanding. Well, it turns out that when scientists analyze these purrs, they find out that the demanding call, what is different is has a particular element in it that is very similar to the cry of a human baby. Now, when I read that paper, I said, I don't believe it. That's a little much. I can believe the purrs are different, but that it sounds like a baby. But then I listened to the recordings they put online, and sure enough, you could sort of hear a baby's cry in that. Now, humans, as you know, are very sensitive. We are innately sensitive to the sound of babies crying. And so it seems that cats have evolved to manipulate us. They know that this sound will grab our attention, and so they've incorporated that into their purr when they really want something from us.
Cats really seem smarter than we might give them credit for.
Well, this is certainly true. They've learned how to train us and manipulate us.
We have another call. Greg is calling from Alton. Greg, you're on St. Louis on the Air. Go ahead.
Hey, thank you very much. So we lost our dog. We had a mixed dog, and he passed away a couple weeks ago. And my wife, we've been married 12 years, and she decided she wanted a Maine Coon.
Okay.
And so, yeah, this is $1,800 cat. So we've done all our research on these things, and they say it's the closest thing to having a dog in the cat world.
Oh.
They said they are extremely loyal. It's actually the largest cat in the world. It's what's in the Guinness Book of World Records is the Maine Coon.
Well, Greg, thank you for your call. Jonathan, what do you have to say about that?
Well, Maine Coons are wonderful cats. I would agree with everything you've said. They are, despite their large size, they can get upwards of 20, 25 pounds sometimes. They make great pets, and they are extremely affectionate and loyal, just as you said. So,
what do they look like? You said that they're heavier,
yes,
but what do they look like?
They're a big cat, very bony, very solid, with long, thick hair. So they look like they're a cat that is made for cold weather. They were originated in Maine, where it gets very cold, and they have shaggy fur. And there's just a very big cat. It looks a little bit, in a sense, like a Siberian tiger without the stripes and so on. But they are excellent cats.
Greg, thanks again for your call. Katie sent us an email and wants to know, is there any truth to the conventional wisdom that fur patterns correlate with personality? For example, that calicos tend to be sassier.
Well, that is widely stated on the internet, and there's another word for that. For tortoiseshell cats, or torties, are supposed to have a lot of tortitude, which is the same sort of thing. The data for that don't really support that. There isn't a lot of research. A lot of people do believe that, but but that has not been confirmed scientifically.
Okay, we have to take another break, but again, we'll be back shortly to continue this conversation, and we do still have some phone lines open, so if you have cat questions, we want to hear them. You can give us a call at 314-382-8255. That's 314-382-TALK. You can also send us a tweet to @STLOnAir or an email to talk@stlpr.org. This is St. Louis on the Air on St. Louis Public Radio.
Support comes from Missouri Forest Products Association, committed to sustainable and sound conservation of the state's forests, which support more than 41,000 Missouri jobs, resulting in a $10 billion industry. ChooseWood.com.
Welcome back to St. Louis on the Air. I'm Alex Heuer, in today for Elaine Cha. My guest is Jonathan Losos, an evolutionary biologist at Washington University and the author of the fascinating and new book, The Cat's Meow: How Cats Evolved from the Savannah to Your Sofa. We have an email from Sarah. Sarah asks, does each cat, through trial and error, figure out what makes their human respond in the desired way, with the result that each one creates an idiosyncratic language? We talked on this a little bit earlier, but are cats intentionally doing this?
I would say yes. Yes, they are. They're very good at training us.
Katie emailed us as well and asked, is there any evidence of when the cat fur colors and patterns we see today first came about?
That is a really interesting question. And when you look on the Egyptian tomb walls, the paintings of the cats are very similar to African wild cats. No sign that they had any of the amazing variety of colors and patterns we see today. When you look at art through the years, white cats and black cats show up in a few centuries BC, and the other colors sort of appear certainly by the medieval times. There were a lot of a variety of today, but it took a while.
So I want to talk about breeding, and cat color and fur patterns really get into this. Most cats are not a member of a specific breed. You write that's true of about 85% of cats, and for reference, that compares to 50% or fewer of dogs who are not members of a particular breed. But before we talk specifically about breeding, how early and often can and do cats have offspring?
Well, female cats can breed at about 6 months of age, so they can reproduce very young. They can sometimes have 3 litters a year. So cats are very prolific, and you can quickly start from one pair of cats and have a large number of them if they're breeding, if they just breed and breed and breed. And
you also point out that there can be changes that happen in a remarkable short amount of time.
Yes, well, this is a revelation about evolution in general, that we used to think that evolution occurred very slowly, over thousands and millions of years. But we now know that when the environment changes, and so natural selection is strong, species in nature can evolve very quickly to adapt to circumstances. And as well, the same thing is true in artificial selection by people breeding animals, by selecting individuals with certain traits. If those traits are genetically based, a domesticated population can be changed very quickly.
Roughly speaking, what's the point of breeding cats?
Well, I would say there are 2 points. On the one hand, there are some, there are some people who just want to create a cat with a particular appearance. And whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, they want to create a cat with a certain color, or there's a mutation like folded ears that they think would be nice to establish a breed based on. And so they just have an idea of a cat that they think should exist, or a dog, or any other domesticated animal. On the other hand, sometimes breeds are developed because we want them to have traits that are beneficial. And so, for example, people have bred some breeds of cats to be very friendly and affectionate, to make them better pets.
For example, which kinds of breeds?
Well, for example, the ragdoll, the European Burmese, the cat that I have, they have intentionally been bred to be very friendly. And so those sorts of traits, others are are bred to be just very placid, very gentle indoor cats. So you can breed for behavior as well, and sometimes this can be very useful.
We have another call. Linda is calling. Linda, you're on St. Louis on the Air.
Hi, pardon me. Over the years, I've had a few calico cats, and they seem to prefer one person to the point where they don't want anybody else to pet them. Is that something that you've observed?
Well, that's certainly true of some cats. I'm not aware that that's a trait specifically of calicos, but certainly there are some cats that are like that.
Okay, Linda. Did you
quick,
have something else, Linda?
Real quick, I had a cat once that had me so well trained, he would scratch wherever he wanted to. I tried to train him to scratch his scratching post by giving him a treat. So whenever he wanted a treat, he would scratch on the scratching post, watch me jump up, give him a treat. Otherwise, he would scratch wherever he wanted.
They're very smart. This reminds me, when I was growing up, whenever our cats would scratch the furniture, my dad would throw them outside. Well, the cats very quickly learned that if they wanted to go outside, they scratched the furniture, and so my father trained them to scratch the furniture inadvertently.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that call, Linda. And you also point out that some of the human behaviors that we have are just maybe not very great. For example, if you feed your cat first thing in the morning, the cat might be waking you up, even if you don't want to get up.
Yes, very bad idea. They're very smart, and if they understand the first thing you do when you get up is feed them, they will try to get you up when they're hungry.
So we talked about the topic of breeding, and something else I learned is that there are cat shows. I think most people are probably well aware of dog shows, the Westminster Kennel Club, but there are cat shows, and Jonathan, you yourself have been to many of these.
Yes, well, they're a very good place if you want to see the variety of different breeds. The breeds of cats are quite diverse in color and hair length and even body proportions. And so these cat shows are where the people who breed the cats bring their cats to exhibit them and to compete for the best of breed of the various different breeds. So they're really a fascinating spectacle. And of course, the people are very interesting themselves. These are people who devote much of their lives to traveling to cat shows and raising cats and so on. So they're very interesting if you're curious about the variety of breeds of cats that exist.
And you mentioned a moment ago your European Burmese Nelson, who lives with you. Nelson is an award-winning cat that you have shown in these cat shows.
Yes. So European Burmese, as I said, are cats that have been bred to be very friendly. And we first got one for my father when he was 85 years old, and we needed a gentle, appropriate lap cat. And we were told European Burmese were the ones to get. And they are just as advertised. And we fell in love with the breed so much that we got one of our own, Nelson. And so we took him to some cat shows, and he did win a few ribbons. Unfortunately, he decided he did not like cat shows, and he started growling at the judges. The judges will take each cat and inspect them on the judging stand, and it's not a good idea for cats to growl at the judges. It seemed like only a matter of time before he bit one of the judges, and so Nelson convinced us that his show days were over.
So a retired show cat.
He is a retired show cat, correct.
So I want to talk about some other breeds. One of them, tell us what a munchkin is.
Well, a munchkin is a breed of cats that has been developed by a mutation that causes very short limbs. The same mutation occurs in humans, and so it is the corgi of cats. From the belly up, it looks like a perfectly regular cat, but it has very short legs. Now, unlike similar dogs, which have spinal problems when they have that elongate shape, the munchkin does not. The cats are not the same as dogs, and apparently there are few health consequences for the munchkin. Nonetheless, I have to say there are people who are against the development of breeds, and they just find they find it wrong to be changing a cat in this way.
Well, and there's a lot of objections, and you write about this in the book, twisty cats. Tell us about that.
Well, the twisty cat is an abomination, and it's not a breed. There is a mutation that causes cats to have no bones in their forelegs or malformed bones such that they can't walk on them. And as a result, these cats, sometimes they're raised by very kind-hearted people, but the cats the cats they hop around like a kangaroo or a rabbit, and they have all kinds of problems. They have trouble using the litter box and so on and so forth. Well, some people in Texas thought they were cute, and word got out that they were trying to breed these cats to develop a breed of twisty cats. Well, fortunately, they were convinced not to do that because that was a terrible idea. I do have to say there are some breeds in both dogs and cats that have health problems as part of their characteristics, and there's a lot of controversy about them. The Persian cat, for example, basically does not have a nose that breeders have selected for. There are dogs breeds like this as well, where the Persian cat has two little nostrils in between its eyes and no external nose. And that causes all kinds of breathing problems and problems with tear ducts and so on. And there are many people who think that breeds like that simply should not exist.
Well, and I have in my notes here that at cat shows that the breed standard for the Persian is, quote, forehead, nose, and chin in perfect vertical alignment. And if you're breeding cats for a specific purpose, frankly, it is no surprise that Persians have been developed in this way. I mean, at some point, are these cat associations with their breed guidelines, are they to blame for the bad health effects that the Persian has because of this?
The Persian is very controversial, and I would say yes, that the Persian has gone too far. The interesting thing is that there was a magazine, an issue of National Geographic in 1938 that showed Persian cats, and they just looked like regular cats. Maybe their noses were slightly shorter than most, but they were regular cats. And so for some reason, over the subsequent few decades, breeders decided they wanted to make the cats' noses shorter and shorter. And why I think they did that because they wanted a short-nosed, big-eyed cat that was very sweet-looking like a baby. But it just got out of control. I can't believe that they initially thought, let's get rid of the cat's nose. But once they started, they got shorter and shorter, and it's clearly gone too far.
And if cat associations are partially to blame for this, I should also point out that they do some amazing work with conservation of the cat, with adoption. And before we went on the air, you were talking about cat shows that are here in St. Louis.
Yes. Yes, I would agree with all that. There is a yearly cat show in August out at Purina Farms out in Gray Summit, and there's also one start that's was in January this year and January next year as well.
I want to talk about something else that is Purina related, and we have an email from Ashley. Ashley asks, I find that my cat allergy symptoms flare up mostly with black and or white cats, but not with other colored cats. Is there something to this?
I'm not aware that there is something to that. There are some breeds of cats that are thought to be hypoallergenic that may produce less of the protein that gets under their skin and into the air and causes allergies. It's not even clear that these breeds really are hypoallergenic, but I'm not aware of any claim about any evidence that color is related to that.
And so the Purina angle of this is that in the not too distant past, Purina has developed a food that helps combat the allergies that people have, because the reason people are allergic to cats is that there's a protein in their saliva. What about this food and the research?
Well, so let me just explain that a little bit more. There's a protein in the saliva of cats. Cats, as everyone knows, lick themselves to groom themselves. The protein gets spread onto the fur and onto the skin. It then dries up and flakes off into the air and becomes dander. And this protein is what causes allergies in many people. What Purina has done is they've made a food that binds to the protein and makes it so that it is not produced as by the cat as much. It binds in the cat's body, and so it's not produced as much. And so as a result, the cat isn't producing the allergen, and so it causes much less allergic response.
And before we went on the air, you were talking about the possibility of a vaccine.
Yes, this has been in the news very recently. A company is developing a vaccine that you would give to cats that would have the same effect as the food. It would reduce the production of this protein and thus make cats less allergic. This company claims that it may be ready next year. I'll believe it when I see it, but it certainly is in development.
There's another interesting Missouri tie in the book, and that is a scientist at the University of Missouri. Her name is Leslie Lyons, and she has a lab there. Tell us about Leslie Lyons.
Well, Leslie Lyons is the world's authority on cat genetics. That people are, and her lab is called the Lyons Den. I mean, what an appropriate name for a cat genetics researcher. But she and other researchers are making great strides in understanding the genetics of cats. And a lot of that work is geared towards finding the genes that cause diseases in cats. Just like humans have genetic diseases, cats have them as well. And they've already had some wonderful successes where they have found that gene and found ways to treat the cats as a result. One way, of course, is if you can find a cat that is a carrier for the gene, you just don't breed that cat, and so that the gene doesn't get passed on. It turns out as well that the genome, that is all the DNA of cats, is very similar to that of humans in many respects. And so a lot of the research, and so there are diseases that both people and cats have. And so the research on cat genetics has implications for human welfare.
And there's a genome sequencing initiative that is run out of that lab where people can get their own cats' genes sequenced?
Yes. So it turns out that the more cats who have their genome sequenced, the better the database and the easier it is to locate genes that cause particular traits or diseases. And so I believe there in the many hundreds of cats have been sequenced now. And if you would like your cat's genome sequenced, you can pay a couple $100, I think. And it's a nice way of contributing to this effort to better the welfare of cats and perhaps even people.
You also write that some of the commercial websites that will tell us the origins of the cats or the mix aren't very reliable. Why is that?
Well, it's complicated, but just as there are companies like 23andMe that you can test your DNA and find out where your ancestors came from, you can do the same thing for cats, that cats in different parts of the world are genetically different a little bit, such that you can look at your cat and say, oh, most of its genes come from Northern Europe, which is actually the case of most American cats. And so there are ways of doing that. What is less reliable is that the tests will tell, there are several commercial products you can buy to test your cat, will tell you your cat is 20% Siamese and 30% Maine Coon and so on. The problem with this is that, as you mentioned earlier, most cats are not members of a breed and do not have any ancestors who are members of a breed. And so it's just a mistake in most cases to say that your cat is, say something, a breed, the British Shorthair, for example. What it really means is your cat came from Northern Europe, and so do British Shorthairs, and it's just a coincidence. So the tests aren't very reliable in terms of breed assignment, whereas in dogs, the tests are quite reliable, but they are pretty good in the geographic origin of your cat.
So I want to return at the end of our hour to evolution, and that is that pet cats are most often neutered, and it are those pet cats that learn to live with us, and that stray cats, ones that often become pets, are ones that are naturally more skittish of humans. And you write about this toward the end of the book, but the idea that we might be going backwards in terms of evolution, can you talk about that a little bit?
Well, as you mentioned, most pet cats are neutered, and so they're not passing their genes on to the next generation. And most pets that people buy, if they're not a member of a breed, come from unowned cats that are rescued by cat advocates when they're kittens usually, and then people adopt them. And so most of the cats are coming from the unowned cat population. And those cats, the unowned cat population, they're not particularly evolving to be friendlier to people. There's no advantage for those cats. And so if anything, they're certainly not evolving to be friendlier. And it may be that if we capture the friendliest of cats living outside, we're leaving the skittish ones and the ones that are the most scaredy cats to reproduce. And so we may be favoring in the unowned cat population cats that become less willing to live with people, more scared, more skittish, and so on. And so it's possible that unowned cats are evolving to be less like the pets that we would like.
We have about 30 seconds left, but what are you most excited about in terms of the future of cat research?
Well, one thing we haven't touched on is what cats are doing outside. Both pet cats, we now have the technology through kitty cameras and radio trackers, but also the many wild cats, the feral cats. What are they doing? How are they adapting to living around the world and so on? And so using the same techniques that I studied lizards, we can understand what unowned outdoor cats are doing.
And you also write in the book about putting GPS trackers on your own cats, and that was one of my favorite parts of the book. And you're right, we did not get to that, but you'll have to get the book to read about that. Jonathan Losos, thank you so much for being a guest today on St. Louis on the Air.
Well, thank you for having me. This was great fun.
Jonathan Losos is an evolutionary biologist at Washington University and the founding director of the Living Earth Collaborative. His new book is called The Cat's Meow: How Cats Evolved from the Savannah to Your Sofa. St. Louis on the Air is a production of St. Louis Public Radio. Understanding starts here.
Our podcast proudly supports St. Louis artists by using music from Life Creative Group.
Do you find yourself regularly listening to episodes of St. Louis on the Air? Suggest us to a friend you think might enjoy our conversations, and leave us a review and rating on Apple Podcasts on the App Store. It's the simplest way to help people discover our show. Thank you.
St. Louis Public Radio is a member-supported service of the University of Missouri St. Louis.
Support comes from the Missouri Forest Products Association, committed to conservation and careful management of the state's forests to make them more resilient and better habitats for wildlife. ChooseWood.com.